This video analyzes the game played between Rubinstein, who played with the white pieces, and Merici, who played with the black pieces. The code of the opening used was D63. This opening is called the Queen's Gambit declined, classical variation with 7.rc1. Result: white won the game. What is the first move of the white player? White, pawn moves to d4, this was an inaccuracy. This opening move, seizing the center with a pawn and making room for two pieces to come out, is efficient. White intends to develop all his pieces as quickly as possible, posting each of them in one move on its most suitable square. He will make only those pawn moves that speed his development, by releasing pieces or attacking the center, or hinder that of his opponent. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to f6. Model development in every respect. The knight leaps in toward the center where it has the greatest potential for attack, exerts immediate pressure on the important squares d5 and e4, and prevents white from establishing a strong pawn formation by 2.c4. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to f3. White develops the kingside pieces first, to enable early castling on that side. At f3, the knight stands on its most useful square in the opening. It is beautifully placed for attack. Notice how it supplements the pawn's grip on c5 and is a peerless defender of the kingside after white castles. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to d5. Black cannot wrest the initiative by brute force. He may get it if white plays carelessly, wasting time in the opening or chasing after pawns. HUD against normal development. Black must content himself with achieving equality. Black's second move neutralizes white's central pressure and opens lines for two of his own pieces. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to c4. One of the rare occasions when a pawn's move which does not aid development is opportune. This one attacks and threatens to eliminate, by 4 pawn from file c takes at d5. Black's center. It does additional service in increasing the mobility, actual and potential, of white's pieces. It clears a diagonal toward the queen and assures the opening of the c-file for the later use of the queen or a one rook. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to e6. Black supports the d-pawn with another pawn. If white tries breaking up the center by 4 pawn from file c takes at d5. Black is prepared to recapture with a pawn to keep the center intact by maintaining a pawn at d5. Although 3 black e6 has the drawback of shutting in the c8 bishop, it is still black's best move. The difficulty in developing the bishop effectively may not seem alarming, but if it is not overcome, it will amount to black playing a piece short. For the present, in partial compensation, the f8 bishop has lots of elbow room. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to g5. This move has a terribly cramping effect on black's game. It clamps a pin on the knight and thereby exerts pressure on any pieces behind it. Black cannot move freely about while his kingside is gripped by the bishop. In the 19th century, white would more often have developed the dark squared bishop at f4, where it commands a useful diagonal. Nowadays we look for sharper, more vigorous moves. If we can mobilize our forces and at the same time restrain the enemy's development, we accomplish more than with routine, often innocuous, measures. The pin of the knight paralyses black's only developed piece. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to e7. Why all the fuss when the pin is so easily lifted? For one thing, in unpinning the knight, the bishop is restricted to a defensive, passive role. Its development has been dictated by the fact that white put pressure on the knight. Black's play, incidentally, is in no way to be deprecated. The bishop's move, modest as it is a step forward in the process of development. The bishop has left the last rank, taken up a strong defensive post, and cleared the kingside, enabling black to castle. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to e3. Pawns should be moved sparingly in the opening, but since some pawns must be moved to get the bishops into play, this must be regarded as a developing move. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight from file b moves to d7. In the queen's gambit declined, the ideal square for the development of the b8 knight is not c6 but d7. From d7, the knight supports an eventual thrust at white's center by the c-pawn or the c-pawn. The knight must not develop at c6, where it blocks the c-pawn. This pawn must not be prevented from advancing to c5, where it can dispute control of the center. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to c3. The white queen's knight, contrariwise, is posted excellently at c3. It does not block the c-pawn and bears down on d5 and c4, two of the four important squares in the center. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, castles on the king's side. Black transfers his king to a more secure location and brings his h8 rook closer to the center files. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook moves to c1. The rook develops where it has the most attractive prospects for attack. At c1 it controls and will exert pressure all along the open c file. The file is obstructed now by white's own knight and pawn, but the pawn can be disposed of by an exchange and the knight can move and clear the file. Strictly speaking, the file is only partly open, but open or not, the rook goes to c1 because control of the c file is absolutely vital in the queen's gambit. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to e8, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to h6, black's rook moves to a center file, where it may play a useful part in any action that takes place in the center. The rook's presence on the file is of little consequence now, but with every clearance on the file, its influence grows stronger and stronger. Black's game is cramped, but alternatives aimed at freeing it immediately are not convincing. 1. 7 Black pawn from file d takes at c4 8. Bishop takes at c4 and white gains a tempo with this bishop, since it recaptures and develops at the same time. 2. 7 Black a6, in order to continue with 8 Black pawn from file d takes at c4 9 Bishop takes at c4 b5 10 Bishop moves to d3 Bishop moves to b7, 8.c5 can be very constraining. 3. 7 Black c5 8. Pawn from file d takes at c5 Knight takes at c5 9. Pawn from file c takes at d5 Pawn from file e takes at d5, not 9 Black Knight takes at d5 10 Knight takes at d5 Pawn from file e takes at d5 11 Rook takes at c5. Bishop takes at g5 12. Rook takes at d5, when white wins the bishop, and black's d5 pawn is weak, while white has the line d4 square as a central point for maneuvering his pieces to any part of the board. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to c2, the best place on the board for the queen. From c2 the queen increases the pressure on the c-file and seizes control of the center, making the problem of freeing himself troublesome for black. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn from file d takes at c4, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to h6, black gets impatient and tries to break loose. It would have been better to delay this capture, though, and wait for white to move his f1 bishop. Then the recapture costs the bishop an extra move. Black might have played instead 8 Black c6, strengthening the position of the d5 pawn and offering the queen an outlet to the queen's side. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop takes at c4, obviously, a gain of time for white, whose light squared bishop recaptures a pawn and develops to a good square simultaneously. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to c5. Black must counterattack or be crushed to death. This offers the most practical chances in that he establishes tension in the center and disputes control in that area. Furthermore, he prepares to oppose rooks on the c-file and light for equal rights on the file. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, castles on the king's side. The simplest way to keep up the pressure is to continue developing. At one stroke white removes his king to a safer part of the hoard and brings the h1 rook out of the corner and toward the center. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn from file c takes at d4. Black's intention is to force white to a decision regarding the center. If white recaptures with a pawn, it saddles him with an isolated pawn in the middle of the board. If with a piece, then his pawn center is no better than black's. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight takes at d4. Rubinstein prefers this to 11. Pawn from file c takes at d4, which maintains a pawn, but one that is isolated, in the center. The weakness of a pawn separated from its fellows lies not so much in the fact that the pawn can only be defended by pieces, but in the peculiar circumstance that enemy pieces can settle themselves on the square directly in front of the pawn, in this case d5, and stay there indefinitely, secure in the knowledge that no enemy pawns can drive them away. The strength of an isolated pawn in the center, for instance at d4, if white recaptured by 11 pawn from file e takes at d4, consists of its control of the strategically important e5 and c5 squares, its ability to spearhead an attack to break up a position, and its value as a support for an outpost in this ease a knight at e5. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to a6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been knight moves to e5, mainly to secure the b5 square from invasion by one of white's minor pieces. The objection to this move is that pawn moves that do not contribute to development are a waste of valuable time in the opening. More to the point is 11. Black knight moves to c5 12. Bishop moves to b3. Bishop moves to d7 13. Rf d1. Queen moves to b6, with a view to getting some action out of his pieces. Notice that white has made only those pawn moves which were necessary to release pieces, or which added to the mobility of pieces already developed. Every single move, a piece or pawn, furthered the development of white's position and increased us potential energy. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook from file f moves to d1. Now the rook swings over to the center, placing itself at the head of a file facing the queen. The queen is sure to feel uncomfortable, no matter how many pieces separate the two, as threats are constantly in the air. For instance, if black should play the plausible 12, black knight moves to b6, attacking the bishop, the reply 13. Knight takes at e6 wins the queen by a discovered, and double, attack. Yates and Winter comment admiringly at this point. A classical example of correct development. White has brought his queen, rooks, bishops and one knight to almost ideal squares in one move each. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to a5. The queen flees the line of fire, gaining a little time by attacking a bishop. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to h4. The bishop retreats but maintains pressure on the knight. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to e5. Now the other bishop is threatened, apparently with more gain of time for black. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to e2. Both bishops have been driven back, but, despite this, their latent power is enormous. The potential of two bishops working in harmony is not to given up lightly, so white does not consider a move such as 14. Bishop moves to d3, which lets black play 14. Black knight takes at d3 and exchange a short stepping knight for a long-range bishop. Condensed, it comes down to this: it is an advantage to keep both bishops. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to g6. Swinging over to the king's side, the knight attacks the dark squared bishop and forces it still further back. Meanwhile, more and more barriers are being put up about black's king, who now seems firmly entrenched in a bomb-proof shelter. Despite all the time black seems to have gained in his attacks on the white bishops, he should have done something to get his queenside pieces off the ground. For instance, by 14 black bishop moves to d7 instead. Then the continuation 15. Knight moves to b3. Queen moves to c7. 16. Queen moves to b1. Bishop moves to c6. Gives him reasonable lighting chances. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to g3. The bishop must step back a square and relax its pressure on the knight, but now it commands a magnificent diagonal. Black cannot continue chasing the bishops in an effort to get rid of one of them, since after 15 black knight moves to h5. 16. Knight moves to b3. Queen moves to g5, the queen must protect the knight. 17. Knight moves to e4. Queen moves to h6. 18. Bishop moves to c7. White dominates the board. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to e5. An extremely attractive move. These are all the things the pawn does. 1. It occupies a square in the center. 2. It opens a path for the c8 bishop. 3. It cuts down the scope of white's g3 bishop. 4. It will drive off white's knight from its centralized position. Against this, black's move offers one objection, seemingly a slight one. The d5 square, no longer under the pawn's control, has been weakened. It offers white the prospect of utilizing this central point for the easy maneuvering of his pieces to any part of the board. Will this one liability outweigh all the assets? It is this judgment of imponderables, where exact calculation is not possible, that makes chess a fascinating blend of art and science. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to b3. The knight must leave but retaliates by getting in a thrust at the queen. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to c7. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to b6, the queen evades the attack, and black prepares to regroup his pieces, perhaps by 17 black bishop moves to d7, 18 black bishop moves to c6 and 19 black rad8. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to b1. This is white's fifth retreating move in succession, but with every step backward his position improves. Though driven back to the first three ranks, his pieces will gain in dynamic energy. Gradually they will take up stronger positions, dominate the board, and put the enemy to flight. Black has no time now to develop his c8 bishop, as after 17 black bishop moves to d7, 18. Knight moves to d5, queen moves to d8, if 18 black knight takes at d5, then 19 rook takes at c7, knight takes at c7, 20 rook takes at d7 wins, 19. Knight moves to c7, white wins the exchange. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to b8. Black's queen was forced to retreat, by the threat of a discovered attack, while white's queen moved to b1 voluntarily. The difference in the positions is apparent. 1. White's queen does not obstruct the rooks, which together control the two open files. Black's queen and bishop separate his rooks, one of which is completely shut in, while the other's action is severely limited. 2. White has two agile, long-range bishops. Black has one, with the other undeveloped and still at home. 3. White's queen can leap into the fray quickly, black's must skulk on the fringes of the board. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to f3. The bishop seizes the long diagonal and prevents black from playing 18 black b5, the punishment being 19 bishop takes at a8, and then fianchettoing his bishop. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to a7, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been rook moves to d8, Black's maneuvering is tortuous, but evidently, he wants to bring his rook to b8, then play b5, and finally develop his queen's bishop at b7. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to a5, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to h4, a fine preventive move. It stops 19 black, rook moves to b8 followed by 20 black b5 as then 21. Knight moves to c6 wins the exchange, while the direct 19 black bishop moves to d7 or 19 black bishop moves to e6 costs black his h-pawn. Notice how white not only sees to the development of his own pieces but hinders that of his opponent. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to b4. Black tries to chase off the knight, which is hampering the free movement of his queenside pieces. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to c4. The knight must leave, but in compensation it enjoys the advantage of being nearer the center. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to d7, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been rook moves to b8, the bishop moves to the only square available for its development. If black tries instead 20 black bishop moves to e6, then 21. Knight takes at e5 wins a pawn, while on 20 black bishop moves to g4 21. Bishop takes at g4 knight takes at g4 22. Knight moves to d5 the threats of 23. Knight takes at b4, winning a piece, and 23. Knight moves to e7, winning the exchange, cannot both be met. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to d5, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been knight moves to e4, the knight leaps to d5 and attacks pieces all over the place. It threatens one bishop directly, by 22 knight takes at b4, and the other indirectly, by 22. Knight takes at f6, check. Pawn from file g takes at f6 23. Rook takes at d7. In addition to this, it threatens 22. Knight moves to c7, attacking both rooks and thereby winning the exchange. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight takes at d5. Obviously, such a dangerous beast must be removed. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop takes at d5. White recaptures with the threat of 23. Bishop takes at f7, check. King takes at f7 24. Rook takes at d7, check. Winning a pawn. He gains a tempo with this, as black must drop whatever he is doing to parry the threat. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to e6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been bishop moves to g4, black must rid the board of the terrible bishop which attacks his king side and restrains his queen side. It would not do to play 22. Black bishop moves to c6 as 23. Bishop takes at c6. Pawn from file b takes at c6 24. Queen moves to e4 wins the c-pawn or the e-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to e4, a master move in every respect, and a one-move lesson in positional play. Where most of us think of an exchange in terms of what happens after 23. Bishop takes at e6, the great master visualizes an exchange as an opportunity to substitute another piece for one that must come off the board. White is willing to exchange, but only if he can be assured of keeping control of d5 by replacing the bishop with another piece. Let me reword this, so that the message is unmistakable. Supporting a piece under attack, here the bishop at d5, puts more pressure on black, where a direct exchange or a retreat might relieve it. Note incidentally the full effect of the queen's magnificent centralization, and her radiation of power in so many directions. 1. The queen supports the bishop at d5. 2. The queen adds to the bishop's attack on the b-pawn. 3. The queen helps in the attack on the c-pawn. 4. The queen threatens, indirectly, black's b4 bishop. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop takes at d5, practically forced in view of the many threats. An attempt to drive the queen off by 23. Black f5 is brusquely refuted by 24. Queen takes at f5 and black, whose bishop is pinned, is unable to take the queen. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook takes at d5. Black rids himself of one troublesome piece only to have another one lake its place. For the third time, white anchors a piece at d5, each time intensifying his grip on the position. Now there is a fourfold attack on the e-pawn, by rook, knight, bishop and queen. While this pawn is being rescued, white will gain the time needed to double his rooks on the d-file, guaranteeing him permanent possession of this vital highway. The effect on black will be to cut communication between his forces, making an organized resistance difficult. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook from file A moves to c8, protecting the pawn indirectly by pinning one of its attackers. White cannot take the pawn with the knight on pain of mate, not with the rook or the queen, as that results in loss of material to white. This leaves 25. Bishop takes at e5, and black is ready to punish that with 25. Black f6 26. Bishop moves to d4. Rook takes at e4 27. Bishop takes at a7. Our pawn from file e takes at c4, when he has gained a piece. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook from file c moves to d1, doubling the rooks on an open file, an act that more than doubles the strength of the rooks. White's knight is now unpinned, and the attack on the e-pawn renewed, with incidentally a threat of discovered attack on the bishop. White has a one game theoretically, and Rubinstein wins it in a way that is both efficient and artistic. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to f8. Black transfers the exposed bishop to the defense. Against the immediate counter-attack by 25. Black f5. White has a winning continuation in 26. Queen takes at f5. Rook takes at c4 27. Rook moves to d8. Rook takes at d8 28. Rook takes at d8, check. Knight moves to f8 29. Queen moves to e6, check. King moves to h8 30. Queen takes at c4, when he is the exchange ahead. After black's actual move, he can answer 26. Knight takes at e5 with 26. Black f6, winning the unfortunate knight. In addition, he contemplates the thrust 26. Black f5, which after 27. Queen moves to d3, to protect the knight, 27. Black f4 occasions some trouble for the bishop. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to b3, frees the queen from the duty of guarding the knight and stops any such move as 26. Black f5, when the pawn would simply be snapped up. Against passive play, white will continue by 27. Rook moves to d7, invading the 7th rank. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to b5. The object of this is not so much to dislodge the knight as it is to open a line for the queen, enabling her to return to the king side and the defense of the king. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to d6. A knight fork which will force an exchange is simplification to white's advantage. He will maintain the pressure inherent in a superior position without running the risk of being involved in unnecessary complications. A premature attack, in fact, might even result in a loss for white. Consider this pretty possibility, instead of the actual move 27. Knight takes at e5 f6 28. Rook moves to d7, apparently a saving move, as Hugh attacks the queen and threatens to follow with 29. Queen moves to d5, check. Unpinning his knight, 28. Black queen takes at d7. And black wins. The recapture by the rook allows black to mate, while 29. Knight takes at d7, rook takes at e4 leaves black a rook ahead. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop takes at d6. Black had no choice, as the knight attacked both his rooks. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook takes at d6. The recapture vacates the d5 square for occupation by the queen. The tripling of heavy pieces on the d-file would increase the advantage that white already has. However, an even more potent threat is the possibility of establishing a beachhead on the 7th rank by 29. Rook moves to d7. The posting of a rook on the 7th rank, in the middle game or the ending, is a tremendous positional advantage. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to c7, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to a8, black does what he can to keep the enemy rook out and seals up all the entrances. White has the superior position, but how does he break through? Let us listen in on what Rubinstein might say to himself in reasoning out a course of action. My rooks are as well placed as they can be and doing a good job in controlling the open d-file. My queen is strongly centralized and exerts pressure in every direction. My bishop hears down on his e-pawn and keeps a rook and knight chained to its defense. My pieces are all usefully occupied and must stay where they are. How about my opponent? His defense just about holds together, but his pieces must stay where they are to guard his weak points. If I leave him alone, he might consolidate his forces, and even counterattack. If I leave him alone, black say, isn't that the key to the position? I must not leave him alone. I must interfere with the arrangement of his pieces. I must drive them off from their present positions. In fact, I might ruin his game by driving off even one defender. Since my pieces are all useful where they are, I must not disturb them but look to my pawns to break up the defense. Which pawn shall I use, and which of his pieces shall I try to dislodge? The first thing to do is to find a target. His queen and rooks are too far away and too agile to be bothered by pawns. Any of them can move off to a different square on a file or a rank and still control it. I must aim at a fixed target, some piece that is needed at the spot where it is stationed and loses its effectiveness as soon as it is displaced. How about the knight? Suppose I played 29.h4 and gave it a nudge by 30.h5. It would have to leave its line defensive position immediately. Where could it go? If to c7, it blocks the action of the e8 rook, and if it retreats to the back rank, it is out of play for a time. Besides, I get another benefit in moving the h-pawn. It gives my king a flight square, so that he doesn't fall into a surprise mate on the first rank. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to h4. This is the key to the decisive attack. The obvious threat is 30.h5, dislodging the knight, and then capturing the e-pawn. The ulterior purpose is to compel black to protect the endangered pawn by 29. Black f6, weakening the cordon of pawns near his king. Further weaknesses may then be induced by h5 and h6, attacking the g-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to f6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to b7, clearly, to give the e-pawn the solid support only another pawn affords. The alternative 29 black rc e7 succumbs to 30. Queen moves to c6 followed by 31. Rook moves to d8, with an easy win, while 29 black h5, to prevent 30. h5, allows 30. Queen moves to f5, winning the h-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to d5 check. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to h5, simple and strong. The queen makes a powerful entrance at d5, seizing control of a diagonal leading to the king and at the same time tripling heavy pieces on the open central file. Notice the admirable use of d5 as a pivot for the maneuvering of the various pieces. It has been occupied in turn by knight, bishop, rook, and queen aptly enough, in order of strength. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, king moves to h8, this was a blunder. A better move would have been king moves to f8, hoping for safety in the corner. If instead 30 black rook moves to f7, then 31. h5 knight moves to h8, 32. h6 decisively breaks up black's defensive pawn wall, or if 30 black king moves to f8, then 31. h5 knight moves to h8, 32. Rook moves to d8, knight moves to f7, 33. Rook takes at e8, check. King takes at e8, 34. Queen moves to e6, check. King moves to f8, 35. h6 rook moves to e7, nothing else saves the game, as 35 black knight takes at h6 allows mate on the move, and 35 black pawn from file g takes at h6, 36 queen takes at f6 leads to ruin for black, 36. Queen moves to c8, check. Rook moves to e8, 37. Pawn from file h takes at g7, check. And white wins a rook. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to h5, this was a blunder. A better move would have been rook moves to d8, this move not only evicts the knight from its strong defensive post but also drives a wedge into black's position. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to f8 against the only other possibility, 31 black knight moves to e7. White wins easily by 32. Queen moves to f7 with a million threats. Let's take a look at some interesting possibilities then. 1. 32 black rook moves to g8, 33. h6, threatening 34 rook moves to d8 followed by mate at g7, 33 black knight moves to f5, 34. Pawn from file h takes at g7, check. Knight takes at g7, 35. Queen takes at f6 and black both loses a pawn and falls into a deadly pin. 2. 32 Black queen moves to b8 33. H6 pawn from file g takes at h6 34. Queen takes at f6, check. King moves to g8 35. Bishop takes at e5. Knight moves to g6 36. Rook moves to d7 with a quick mate. 3. 32 Black RCC 833. H6 pawn from file g takes at h6 34. Bishop moves to h4, threatening 35. Bishop takes at f6, checkmate. Black cannot guard against that mate by a knight move as it leaves his queen and prize. How many of these variations did White foresee? And how many did Black know he was avoiding when he moved his knight to f8 instead of to c7? The answer is probably none. A good player can, almost at a glance, sense the effect of a move that is obviously decisive. He saves himself a great deal of valuable time when he does not even bother about analyzing the resources of such a defense as 31 Black knight moves to e7. The fact that it permits such a paralyzing entrance into the vitals as 32 Queen moves to f7 practically rules it out from more than fleeting consideration. What do you think it was the next move of the White player? White, pawn moves to h6. White drives the wedge in still further. White's object is to break up the pawn position around Black's king. If Black's g-pawn can be uprooted, it will make the f-pawn, the keystone of his game, vulnerable to attack. And if that falls, Black's whole position falls with it. White's immediate threat is 33. Pawn from file h takes at g7, check. King takes at g7 34. Bishop moves to h4. Rook moves to f7 35. Queen moves to c6, with an attack on the e8 rook and a triple attack on the f-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the Black player? Black, knight moves to g6, this was a mistake. A better move would have been queen moves to b7, Black gets his knight back into active play and prevents White from sinking again at the f-pawn by 33. Bishop moves to h4. He sidesteps the pretty loss 32 Black pawn from file g takes at h6 33. Rook takes at f6. Rook moves to d7 34. Bishop takes at e5. Rook takes at d5. If 34 Black rook takes at e5, 35 rook takes at f8, check. And mate next move, 35. Rook takes at f8, checkmate. Double check and mate. What do you think it was the next move of the White player? White, queen moves to e6, this was a blunder. A better move would have been rook moves to d8, a spectacular move. White is not playing to the gallery in offering a queen sacrifice. All that he wants is to penetrate still deeper into the heart of Black's position, and this is the simplest way to do so. The move is brilliant, nevertheless, and making a move of this sort, even vicariously, gives one a thrill. I must warn the player who likes the excitement of springing a surprise move on his opponent that it is a waste of time to look for brilliant moves in the course of a game unless the position warrants it. You must first get an advantage, however slight. Work on increasing the advantage until you have built up a position that is definitely superior. Once you have established your right to look for combinations, the brilliant moves will come of themselves. White of course does not expect Black to take his queen and allow 34. Rook moves to d8, check. And a quick mate. What he has in mind primarily is to secure complete control of d7, an important square for his rooks to exploit. One of the most interesting things to me in the position is that white threatens his opponent with disaster on 3 ranks, 1, on the 8th rank by 34. Queen takes at e8, check. Followed by mate. 2, on the 7th rank by 34. Rook moves to d7 followed by 35. Pawn from file h takes at g7, checkmate. 3, on the 6th rank by 34. Pawn from file h takes at g7, check. King takes at g7 35. Queen takes at f6, check. Winning easily. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to f8, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been rook from file c moves to e7, there isn't too much choice, in view of all the threats black's move gives the f-pawn added protection. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook moves to d7 threatening 35. Pawn from file h takes at g7, checkmate. Mate on the move. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn from file g takes at h6 34. Black rook takes at d7 is no better since the recapture 35. Rook takes at d7 threatens mate on one side, and the queen on the other. White also forces mate after 34. Black rook moves to g8 35. Pawn from file h takes at g7, check. Rook takes at g7 36. Rook moves to d8, check. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to h4. The bishop, which has stood in one spot for 25 moves, applies the finishing touch. The threat is 36. Bishop takes at f6, check. Rook takes at f6 37. Queen takes at f6, check. King moves to g8 38. Queen moves to g7, checkmate. 1-0 if 35. Black knight takes at h4, then 36. Queen moves to e7 threatens 37. Queen takes at f8, checkmate. 37. Queen moves to g7, checkmate. Or 37. Queen takes at h7, checkmate. And no one can survive such a display of feminine power. An impressive, deeply satisfying game, one of the finest in the literature of chess.